On behalf of SEAA, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you attending this virtual talk featuring Dr. Elizabeth Charles Johnson and her latest publication, Metamorphic Imagery in Ancient Chinese Art and Religion. Before we begin the talk, I would want to remind everyone that this talk will be recorded. I also kindly request everyone turns off the camera and mute the volume. This will help ensure smooth internet connections for the duration of the talk. Now, I would like to go over the itinerary for today's event. In a few moments, I'll hand over the floor to Dr. Tom Michaels, Associate Professor in the School of Philosophy at Beijing Normal University, who will provide a brief introduction of Dr. Elizabeth Charles Johnson. Following that, Dr. Charles Johnson will give a short talk about her book. After the talk, our first discussant, Dr. Tom Michaels, will share his thoughts on the book and the field of archaeology from the perspective of specialists in Chinese history and religion. Then our second discussant, Dr. Lin Min, Associate Professor of East Asian Archaeology at UCLA, will provide us with insights on Dr. Charles Johnson research from the perspective of Chinese archaeologists. Following the discussion, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have any questions, we kindly ask you to hold on to them until the end. With that said, I would like to pass the torch to Dr. Tom Michaels, who will introduce Dr. Elizabeth Charles Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening to you guys in America. Yeah, I'm here to introduce Elizabeth Charles Johnson, and I think I'd just like to say a word about how I met her. About 8 years ago, I published a pretty big article called Shamanism Theory and the Early Chinese Wu. Wu was a term for shamanism, and I tried to bring ancient and early Chinese shamanism more into conversation with contemporary shaman theory. Zhang, Yadi, David Kate, so on and so forth. And of course, I mentioned or Elizabeth or Becky here. How would you like us to call you? You're muted. How should I refer to you? What?
Go ahead.
Should I refer to you as Becky or Professor
Becky.
Charles Johnson?
Becky's
okay.
fine. Yeah.
Okay. And shortly after my article came out, I met Becky. She gave me an email. She was furious at me. She said, "Why are you associated?"
I think there may be some connection problem.
What's happening to you, Tom?
Second.
I want to know the end of that story here.
Hey, Tom, are you there?
International conference on shamanism. We put on a conference on shamanism about 5 years ago. We were also honored to have not only Becky, but the very eminent Laurel Kendall, together with several other eminent scholars. And at that time,
Uh-oh. Tom?
with John Major, I should also fabulous new book called Metamorphic Imagery in Ancient Chinese. I'm not exactly sure how much he did of this, but I can sort of tell the parts that he did. He's a fabulous specialist in Chu period art and history, the ancient state of Chu. And so what Elizabeth does is she uncovers the Shang period institutionalized shamanism that was established and serving as the basic political and social foundations of rulership. we're going to talk a lot more about that as we get into this presentation, but that's from my perspective, that's the great thing she does. Again, I'm not an archaeologist. Professor Lee Min will have more to say about that. I just want to recognize some of Becky's publications in addition to this fabulous book that just came out. I believe that her masterpiece, as far as I'm concerned, is something called the Metamorphic Image, a predominant theme in Shang ritual art. This was published as the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. Is it an article? Is it a book? Is it a monograph? It's about 170 pages. The first half of it is very theoretical and just fabulous. The second half are all wonderful, wonderful pictures that document the visualness of this institutionalized shamanism that she's talking about. And when I teach my shamanism courses, this is one of the required readings, actually. That was published in 1998. I don't know how easy it is to get your hands on. I had a hard time finding it. I got it through Becky, but that's, in my opinion, her masterpiece, second to her book. She's also published The Bird in Shang Ritual Art. If you are familiar with the book that she just wrote, there's a lot of the Feng bird going on in there. And then one of my favorite titles is another one of her articles, Urban Demons of the Early Shang. And I always felt like I had to put on my leather jacket to read that one. Recently, again, another great piece, that book that she just came out with, co-edited with John Major, is the Oxford Handbook of Early China, which really supersedes everything else written on China. Different articles. Becky has several, John has a couple, and the top archaeological scholars in the field from all over the world. So with that as my introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Becky right now.
Anyway, I want to thank you very much again, Mitchell, for putting this together, and Anki Hein, if she's awake. Some of you are in your pajamas, some of you are probably drinking coffee, but my talk, I will try and make it even shorter. It's about 20 minutes as requested. And I will show you initially a bunch of visuals just to get you into the throes of what our book is all about. And I must admit, I really enjoyed working with John Major. I mean, we've been meeting about this whole context or issue of shamanism. I'm also with Gopal Sukhu, but John, we took the bull by its horns and decided to go ahead with this. And it took a while, but we're so glad to have this imprint at it, but I haven't. Anyway, I want to show you a few pictures just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with from the beginning of late Neolithic, or what I call Jade Age, through the Warring States period. And so this is one of the images that we deal with, a bronze yo. These are other images of metamorphic imagery. They're all metamorphic in content and significance. And one thing I promised John I would emphasize, I asked for his advice, and he said, just emphasize that this is all completely new in terms of interpretation. So here are two other examples of a jade with this metamorphic imagery of a so-called phoenix. It's actually based on the peacock, but it's a spirit bird. And then this semi-human whose legs go like this and either end in bird claws or a dragon. And this, of course, is another semi-human image whose body is wrapped in the same way that this one is on the left, and with a tiger, but this is a design on a Western Joe axe. And this crouching body in the form of a squatting bird with claws is very typical of the metamorphic image from Jade Age through the Shang period. And another image, which is absolutely fantastic. This is a detail on an Eastern Joe vessel with this semi-human image holding onto snakes. And you can see his little feet right here are clawing a mask, which if you've studied this art for a long time is a abstract representation of the tiger mask. Below that, the buffalo mask. And below that, possibly another mask, which is indicated by these curling horns of the wild sheep. So here we have an image as late as the Eastern Joe period, around the 6th century BCE, that continues this whole pattern and emphasis upon this incredible metamorphic imagery. Other examples, just to cue you in, of the dragon. Wait a second. And a gray bronze vessel, which has this dragon with a mouth open, a curling tail, two different interpretations. This is a feline dragon of true origin, and this is a Western Joe ritual bronze gwei on a stand with repeated imagery of this curling-tailed, open-mouthed dragon. A Western Joe interpretation, a true interpretation of metamorphic themes. And so what I want to talk about here is, in this book, what we have presented is a completely new theory about the development of ancient Chinese religion. And I'm reading this, but so you can stop me or ask, well, I guess we're going to have a chat at the end of this, so I'll leave it open to that. But it's about the development of ancient Chinese religion. Our thesis is that metamorphism was can I make these images smaller? Yeah. Okay. Was central to ancient Chinese religious belief and practices from at least the late Neolithic period, as I've said, through the Warring States period, the Zhou dynasty, and remained absolutely fundamental to Chinese ways of thinking about the world and human interactions with that world. Now, central to our argument is the principal motif in early Chinese figurative art. Here again, you see a jade with this bird and a semi-human whose feet end in bird claws, again, a symbol of flight. So the central to our argument is that this image, anachronistically known in Shang and Western Zhou studies as Taotie, we show that while that motif underwent considerable stylistic variation over time, its formal properties remained remarkably consistent, underscoring the image's ongoing religious centrality. So in the book, we demonstrate that this power image represented metamorphosis of royal personages, from living humans to deceased ancestors who required worship and sacrificial offerings. Their visages bespoke their numinous power. By numinous, we mean spiritual and awe-inspired emotion aroused by the presence of divinity. It's an overused term, but it's definitely appropriate here. Now, treated with suitable deference and generous respect, the royal ancestors could act in support of their living descendants, ratifying and upholding their rule. Neglected, they became dangerous and even malevolent. Well, there's one of my slurred words, malevolent, whatever it is. Over the long period covered by this book, the privilege of worshiping spiritually transformed ancestors expanded from a narrow ruling lineage to a wider elite, and the symbolism of the metamorphic power image emerged under the influence of changing social political structures. Okay. All right. So is this what any satisfactory, these are some more metamorphic images. Let me get this down here. Hold on. Well, we observe the importance of this concept of metamorphism, the dynamic between imagery, materials, and effects, as articulated by anthropologists. And in that sort of anthropological approach, the authors, as you can see in the print, Jones and Cochrane, elucidate style and meaning, which one needs to recognize recognize the importance of effective practices such as gesture exaggeration, blah, 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 blah. So the latter considerations enable key concepts such as style and meaning, which is essential to any interpretation of art and religion, to be reimagined as effective practices, particularly in the field of ancient art and imagery. So this is again, these are 3 bronze Yo vessels of Shang and Western Zhou with this metamorphic power mask, sometimes articulated complexly and sometimes less complexly. Now, if I can get this to go down, I don't know how I can't. Okay, I can't. So in these pages in the book, we use a few terms that may not be totally familiar to you or fully established as part of the discourse on early China, and therefore require some discussion and clarification. For example, I make frequent use, or we make frequent use of the term Jade Age. It refers to the phase at the end of the Neolithic period when technology of jade working reached a high point and objects of finely worked jade symbolized the apex of wealth, prestige, and cultural power. After 2000 BCE, while jade retained considerable cultural power, it became eclipsed by bronze vessels as prestige goods. And there is the so-called pig dragon, because of the simulation of to archaeologists of a boar head and the body, curling body of a dragon, similar to the oracle bone script for the word long or dragon, and the continuation of this metamorphic form and transposed visual guise with the body ending in a long, sinuous, snake-like form and a dragon head, but with the metamorphic power mask of a semi-human being. Okay, so the term East Asian heartland was coined by Victor Mayer, and I'm not going to dwell on this. It's just because China has not been, did not become until historic times used to describe China. So that's used in our book, and it encompasses the land from the northern edges of the North China Plain to the southern reaches of the middle and lower Yangtze River Valley, Sichuan, Weihan, Huai, and other major river valleys and adjacent territories. Now, the great majority of sites discussed in these pages are within this heartland region. And these are two works of art which show imagery here of a semi-human squatting and of a detail of ritual bronze with similar exaggerated horns, not snakes in this case, but a feline dragon. Just other examples to keep you visually stimulated. Now, in using the term metamorphic, there are 2 interrelated phenomena, and this is important to realize. Figurative imagery, as you can see in these images below, that can be viewed as an image that is mask-like when viewed as a whole or a deified ancestor transformed, but it may dissolve into its component parts, looking simplified. And on the other hand, the ability of a person, whether a living king or a dead royal ancestor, to achieve a state of metamorphic empowerment, known in the oracle bone term E, that endows the recipient with special powers and religious efficacy. The evidence for this metamorphic imagery is likewise of 2 kinds. The imagery itself expressed through the art in various media, and with the emergence of Shang period oracle bone inscriptions and other divinatory texts, it appears in those contexts. So you have the written and you have the representational. Now, the physical evidence shows that metamorphic imagery in early Semitic cultures went back to Neolithic times, reached its apogee in Shang, continued to exist and evolve as a cultural theme in the Western Zhou, springs and autumns and warring states experience, and beyond. As we demonstrate, metamorphic imagery in art and religion was continuous from that late Neolithic Jade Age period through the warring states. This is a jade showing the semi-human with, in this particular case, human hands and with a body in the shape of an abstract reduction of the cicada, and another example of the cicada body and arms ending in claws, and of course, exaggeratedly interesting mask. And this is another image, and this is another image. This is a tiger over a human head, looking like it's devouring, but its devouring is a symbolic act of transformation. Here, the image is semi-human with human attributes, is again the attribute of metamorphosis into the animal world. And these are some more. Much ink has been. How do I get rid of this stuff? has been written, okay, hold on, about shamanism in other cultures, and mostly from the point of view of literary rather than artistic genres. What most of these studies and our own have in common is the belief in some form of transformation. This is true in Olmec, Mayan, American Indian, the Haida, Kwakiutl, lots of those. Whether it's some belief in form of transformation, whether it's labeled zoanthropy or therianthropy or shapeshifting, the Chinese context is enhanced by paleographic data, which is not the case in the Mesolithic Danube boulder art, where you see, shape-shifting, nor does the Chinese case depend on mythic associations, although the latter may be revealed, we hope, in more detail with the discovery of excavated datable texts and references. Other terms specifically relevant in the ancient Chinese case, and this right here is the word for E, to metamorphically transform and to be empowered metamorphically. This is the case of E in Shang bone inscriptions. As I said, this is what it means, as I've published long ago. Now, a king alone was the Yu Yiren, and this is misquoted in our book, which I'm sorry to say, but this is how it should be. But the king alone maintained in Shang period the metamorphic empowerment and continued to exercise that power after death. So the ubiquitous metamorphic power mask in Shang ritual art is probably a representation of a metamorphically empowered ancestor king. The ability of the living king to E is the basis for our use of the term institutional shamanism, with reference to China's early monarchical states. So this E is the same, it's equivalent to the image of Tai Yi, or the unified one in late Zhou Western Han art, and of course the hunting image of Shang emblem on a ritual bronze, of probably a reference to the king with his horses and his hunting dog. So anyway, we can't go into everything, but Bin is another Shang oracle bone term that is very important with relevance to the concept of metamorphosis. It means not to visit, Binzhi, it's not that type of visit as has been commonly identified, but to spiritually accompany and identify with a deceased royal ancestor or a deity such as Di, Shang Di, the high cosmological god of Shang religion. So both Yi and Bin were royal prerogatives of the king alone. He had those powers only. And we use the term metamorphic power image, metamorphic power mask, to refer to the composite motif, such as you see here, described above, that symbolizes a royal personage transformed by death into a deified royal ancestor. That motif is almost ubiquitously, but incorrectly, known as Taotie in the literature of ancient China. And I've published, and I don't see any references ever to my proof that Taotie is anachronistic and wrong. Although one scholar has mentioned that, although it wasn't used by the Shang, it's a traditional name, so it continues to be used by that author. That will not do. Our objection to Taotie has two bases. It's anachronistic and misleading. The term does not, the term in Han times means glutton. The texts of is one of the texts of monstrous beings that inhabited the so-called Taotie of Han times, inhabited the imaginary world of that era. It is described as ravenously hungry but unable to swallow, probably because, like the metamorphic power mask, it has no lower jaw, or popularly and commonly has no lower jaw. And it just may be a backstory to the imagination of the time to describe the highly prized heirloom of the Shang bronzes. So the term became entrenched in the vocabulary of art history in the Song Dynasty, but the anachronism remains inappropriate to discuss the religion of Jade Age and Bronze Age China. It is also misleading because what should be seen as a motif symbolizing the immense spiritual power of the deceased royal ancestors is reduced and trivialized as a depiction of an unimportant warring state's imaginary monster with peculiar eating habits. It is time, and I hope you all agree, and indeed past time, to retire this term, tautier. So we begin our book with the several chapters on the Jade Age, with rhetoric representations on ceramics from earlier cultures, and we don't include the Yangshao fish masks. Intriguing though they are, Bampo fish masks are outside the purview of this study. The Yangshao was basically overlain by Longshan jade materials, and here is a Longshan jade axe with a semi-human and body that ends in a leg extending and ending in claws. Whoops, I was not supposed to end yet. Hold on. Oh, come on. Okay. So, and this is a stone monument from Shimao in Shanxi with this image that's in Arlito or on Longshan bronzes. This is all the same image represented with different stylistic attributes. This is on the Arlito ceramic with two tigers about to devour this semi-human in a crouching pose. And this is the same thing. It's Shimao Shanxi. Recently discovered, and again, these are drawings of my own of the imagery, or actually Hayashi Manao's on two faces of this jade axe of Longshan period date, the late Jade Age. So, with that, I'm going to end my discussion in metamorphic imagery. I think you've seen enough visuals, and this is the word E to metamorphically transpose, and this is one of the more powerful rubbings of that image on a ritual bronze. So thanks very much, everybody, for listening to this. I hope it wasn't too long or too detailed or too esoteric. 感谢大家.
Hi, I'm Thomas Michael again. I'm going to say a few words about Becky's book. A big content of some of the things that Becky was just talking about was this notion of metamorphosis, and it has two kinds of meanings that she's talking about. One is it was almost the name, not quite the name, but pretty close to the name of the mask itself. And the other meaning of E is the metamorphosis of the ruler metamorphizing into an animal in relation to the ancestors, to the spirit world. And just to nail this down a little bit more, I'm just going to read one paragraph from the book. So I'm going to do this on a share screen. And let me get these pictures out of the way. This is from page 42. So the standard formats reinforce the conclusion that these E images, which we've just seen several pictures of from Becky's presentation, represent the metamorphosis of a deceased elite male, the ruler, into a divine power. So this paragraph, whoops. What happened? 43. So this paragraph that I want to read very quickly gives details about this mask. We may speak of these repeated images that we've just seen many pictures of as metamorphic power symbols. First and foremost, again, what I'm getting at is what is the shamanism involved in this? First and foremost, the images are flat and heraldic. Second, they combine both real and fantastic attributes, not simply animals, but other elements as well, fantastic elements. Third, sometimes cosmic birds in profile flank the semi-human figure, the king, and zoomorphic mask, but they are always subordinate to the central power image. Fourth, The humanoid is always represented symbolically as dominating the animal. This is also represented with the animal devouring the human. We saw two tigers devouring the human. That's the metamorphic moment, right? And the king riding the animal as if the humanoid has been transformed into an immortal deity able to travel within the spirit realm. So have a lot of flight going on here, right? Shamanic flight. Fifth, the elongated bent arms of the humanoid and similarly those of the zoomorphic mask may be simplified as extended wings without claws or human digits. Sixth, the zoomorphic mask, when represented as a complex image, takes on the attributes of flight. Since the limb pairs are always decorated with wing-like excrescences. Seventh, cloud scroll clusters symbolizing the sky always fill all parts of the image that would otherwise be vacant. Shoot. Alluding to the cosmological spirit flight and transformation of the human from this world to the spirit realm. In both their complex and schematic forms, these icons of metamorphic power symbolize the ability of deceased elite males, kings, to take on attributes of flight and supernatural transformations. So there's a whole lot that's compacted in there that I want to try to unpack a little bit. First of all, one of the points that I always emphasize in my work on shamanism is that I see a strict difference between shamanism and the shaman. The shaman is an ethnological category, right? Primarily Siberia. Shamanism is a theoretical category. And the way that I talk about shamanism itself, so what we're looking at right now is an institutionalized form of very ancient Chinese shamanism. So my understanding of shamanism is that it refers to representations of direct communication between humans and spirits in a seance event for the benefit of the community. So we haven't yet seen the seance event. You can take the word seance, you can take it or leave it. If you have a better word, please send it to me because it has some spiritualism connotations from 19th century Victorian age stuff. But by the seance event, I mean the moment when the transformations, the metamorphoses happen. One of the great things about Becky's understanding of shamanism is that it really leaves behind entirely the whole Iliadian conceptual scheme of he's actually mostly talking about shamans, and he wants to call it shamanism, but we have to maintain a really strict difference between that. So ancient Chinese has a term for something which is similar to the shaman. It's called Wu. Lots of things we can say about the Wu. They do shamanic things, but they're not shamans, and they do lots of other things which are not shamanic at all. So by shamanic, again, I mean representations, cultural representations of direct communication between human beings and spirit beings. Becky never uses the word shaman, and she never uses the word Wu. And she does not locate the shamanism in the ecstatic spirit flight. She mentions once or twice in the book, possibly there may have been some mind altering intoxicants, liquids, or drugs or something like that. Maybe, maybe not. It's not central to the core of shamanism. Talking about altered states of consciousness, really, in my opinion, I follow very closely Robert Hamayon on this. Associating shamanism with altered states of consciousness just is a failing enterprise on every level. And when we're talking about shamanism, so she leaves Iliade behind by getting rid of the notion of ecstatic flight as the core definition. She gets rid of focus of shamanism on the shaman, whether we call it a woo or any particular other ethnographic category. And third, there's no comparison with the gold standard, right? Siberian shamanism. And when we think about shamanism, we think about Iliade, we think about his Siberian shamans, we think this is pure shamanism, right? From the beginning of human civilization. That's crazy. The Siberian shamans Iliade was looking at are less than 1,000 years old. And what we're looking at with the shamanism of China is over 3,000 years old, right? So that is something to take very real account of. We don't have anything to compare it to, right? Not from something 3,000 years ago, nothing like this. This is the earliest formation of institutionalized shamanism that you will find anywhere in the world. Now, when we talk about Casey Zhang, Iliade, of course, denied that there was shamanism in ancient China. He made a couple of remarks, yeah, maybe in the most ancient past, but with his ethnographic Wu as a shaman, he said the Wu are not shamans, they are mediums, right? So Casey Zhang sort of took a funny turn on that. He said, yeah, okay, we're talking about the Wu here, but in fact, the Wu are shamans, right? And so he accepts Iliade's foundation in the ecstatic flight as a core definitional property of shamanism. But then he says this is the Wu, and then he goes on to say, and the original Wu were the ancient kings. And so we're getting into all kinds of gnarly issues with this, altered states of consciousness and all these sorts of things. So what Becky does is she really uncovers in a fundamental way this institutionalized form of shamanism, which is really structured around a couple of central points, right? The first point is it's entirely focused on the king. Now, just a quick aside on that. In my own work on shamanism, my own work on Taoism, primarily Tao Te Ching, I've always resisted trying to have these things reduced to the king, right? When Lao Tzu himself talks about the sage, people want to say, this is the king. Lao Tzu's talking about a very strict political philosophy. I still believe that. It was later commentators to the Tao Te Ching who turned Lao Tzu's sage into a ruler. But this was my hesitation. When I looked at ancient Chinese shamanism, I didn't want to concentrate it in the single figure of the king. It sounded far too reductive to me. This, I think, is the most important thing that I've learned from Becky's researches, her studies on this institutionalized shamanism. It really is about the king, right? Even if we think about the notion of the mandate of heaven, that only applied to the king and to his family. Nobody else was part of the retributions of heaven, of the mandate of heaven. This is the same for the ancient Chinese. Basically, mostly I'm talking about Shang Dynasty, quite possibly Western Zhou, right? So the core elements of this institutionalized shamanism is the king, right? And then the metamorphosis involved is the transformation of the king into, not into, but going into the spirit realm. And we've seen from that passage that I just read, as well as all the images that we've seen from Becky, this is the shamanic flight, right? And we're used to seeing our Siberian shamans riding their drums as their mounts, different shamans in different cultures mounting to fly. I'm not trying to identify the king as a shaman, not at all. But what I am pointing out is, in terms of the definition of shamanism that I maintain, representations of direct communication between human beings and spirit beings, this nails it right there, right? And it goes both ways. The king both ascends to the spirit.
It seems like I have a connection problem, Dr. Michael. Hi, Dr. Michael, are you still with us?
Has been, for a very long.
I think he'll rejoin us very shortly. Sorry for the yes.
Yeah, I'm still in Beijing. Haven't left. The second element is the bin. And for a very long time, right, I believed what everybody said, that this was just calling down the spirits so that they could eat the smoke from the sacrifice. But no, this is actually an identification of the king with the called down spirit, the ancestors, right? So we have the king, we have the ancestors, and we also have D, the great god who has some complicated relationship with the ancestors, but D is really in control of everything. When we read all of our stuff from David Cately and Robert Eno and all these sorts of things, that D never received sacrifice, and these kinds of claims about D, what Becky shows is that no, the king himself in his metamorphic flights was never identified with D, but associated with D in D's presence, right? Again, this form of direct communication. So in these ways, what Becky's doing, understandings of what was happening, particularly in Shang Dynasty religion. So we have the king, we have the ancestors, we have D, and we have the beasts, the animals. And I have tried to typologize different forms of shamanism, bureaucratic shamanism, pastoral shamanism. I rely on Carolyn Humphreys and Robert Hamayon, hunting shamanism, different forms of shamanism, right? This form of shamanism, that Becky is uncovering, I would like to call it a form of hunting shamanism, because this is where it all comes together, is in the hunt. I need to find a different word for what Becky's talking about, because the hunting shamanism has already been co-opted by Robert Hamayon, and it has a very different ideology. When the shaman, we're talking about the areas where the term shaman really is used, the shaman marries the daughter of the master of animals, and there's an exchange between humans and animals, right? Humans eat the animals, and the animals get to kill some humans to keep the balance right. This is not what's happening in this ancient shamanism, this ancient Shang Dynasty shamanism. It's something very different. So I don't want to call it a hunting shamanism, because it's very different from what Robert is talking about, right? So metamorphic shamanism, but lots of shamanism has metamorphosis in it. So maybe Becky, I'm going to talk to Becky in the future about this. Is there a kind of identifying label for this type of shamanism? The other thing I want to say is about the hunt, right? So what is the importance of this hunt? So I'm again taking some notes from Becky's book. the hunt was only performed by the king. He was the hunter, right? He was surrounded by all of his ministers and, his whole retinue and everything like that. When the king hunted, what he killed was tallied. It was widely publicized. It was deeply ritualized. It happened in what we call parks. It sounds ridiculous to me. I don't know how to imagine these parks, but some sort of enclosed wildland. Want to have a picnic there. And it was equated with war, right? In order to begin the hunt, this is when this event, I call it a seance, we can again find better words for it, when the king metamorphizes into the animal, empowers himself to then go into the park to hunt the animals. And this hunt authorized all kinds of other activities, primarily war, right? You don't just go to war. No, the king has to metamorphosize into the animal, connect with the spirit world through the hunt, blah, blah, blah. And then the animal that the king kills is then taken to the temple to be sacrificed, where yet again, we have another metamorphic event of the king communicating with the ancestors and in the spirit world through riding the animal, right? He's mounting the animal. He mounts it in part by becoming devoured by it, right? So that's my presentation. That's what I want to say. This is what I find utterly fascinating about this whole project that Becky and John are working on, this uncovering of ancient Chinese shamanism that just puts to rest so much of what we thought we may have known about ancient Chinese shamanism, institutionalized shamanism. There's still a tremendous amount of work to do on this, as Becky recognizes in her book, but she sets us really on a very clear path. Now we kind of know some of the things that we need to look for and keep our eyes open for. There's just great potential and then we look further into Chinese history, further on our side, coming, after the spring and autumn. Then we get into the Warring States. And then that's when we can start talking about the Wu in more substantial ways. We can talk about different forms of shamanism which have evolved out of this ancient Chinese shaman. Connie Cook wrote a magnificent book upon this. There's some very interesting things written about. I focused my own work on the Joga and the Chutsa. But having this base knowledge of what's going on in the Shang dynasty and the Western Zhou just opens so many more avenues of approach to ancient Chinese shamanism, to early Chinese shamanism, as well to the cultural phenomenon of shamanism in China throughout the ages. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. I guess we can pass on to Dr. Li Min.
Hello, let me share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint? Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, great. So my name is Li Min. I'm associate professor at UCLA in the Department of Anthropology and Asian Language and Cultures. So I'm very excited to see this book. Actually, I have been reading about Becky's work since the 90s when I was a college student in Canada. I want to mention that I have heard about her research about person from a very dear friend of mine, a scholar I really respect, Professor Shao Ping from the Institute of Archaeology, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Shao collaborated with Becky on Jade research, and she said Becky was very kind to her. So, this is a good chance for me to express gratitude on her behalf. I only communicated with Becky over the years, but I've been familiar with these ideas ever since reading about it in the 90s. As you can see from that PowerPoint on the right is a workshop we just had about 2 weeks ago, late May, on the theme of religious communication and political authority, political power in early Chinese and Mayan civilizations. And we used this opportunity to pay tribute to the work of Casey Chang on shamanism. And to our surprise, he actually find inspiration not only from the anthropological and the religious study sources that you have just heard from Michael, but also from a Mayan archaeologist, Peter First, who was a graduate student at UCLA and a professor here. So, and he's very much into hallucinogenic material, shamanism, religious communication, and trance. The very aspect of shamanism that Michael critiqued. So in this workshop, many students use the word of metamorphism, metamorphic transformation. As you can see from the Chinese title, from cocoon to butterfly, it implies that. I think many students, I have to tell them that they didn't realize that Becky have introduced this concept to Chinese archaeology decades ago. So I think it's very fitting to put these themes together to see how these inspirations tracing back all the way to 1980s, can still give us ideas to move forward. Okay, so here is from Becky's own book, where a parallel trajectory into these themes were laid out between Casey Chang and her dissertation, both finished in the early 80s. So in a way, we're celebrating these ideas that has been put forth in the study of Chinese archaeology for decades ago. It's very fitting to put them side by side. What I liked about this book, one, of course, is the idea of metamorphism, a concept that would place this dynamic aspect in Chinese art that has very deep roots, this key concept that can trace from early beginnings all the way to later, more articulated ideas, institutional ideas of kingship. So these two are very important. And this institutional shamanism is a very important concept. That is, when you think about it, shamans in the village or in Altai or in Tibetan Plateau, those kind of behavior, the esoteric behavior, are incompatible with institutions. Bureaucracy and the shamans who constantly enter a trance, they just don't go together. And how do they put these things? How did the early leaders put these two traditions together in a coherent form we call Shang kingship? That is the question we want to explore. And that brings us to the second point, that is this longue durée approach, a deep history approach that takes us all the way to Middle Neolithic, if not earlier. 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, when these shamanistic forms take place, as Becky correctly identified in the Hongshan society in the Ling River Valley. And that's what Professor Li Xinwei, who attended the workshop on his way to Copan to conduct his Mayan excavations, presented kind of metamorphic transformation insects, those pig dragons showing insects in development. So this deep history approach, longue durée, is very appealing, especially with this powerful dynamic central concept. You know, you can observe its evolution. And also the willingness to recognize meaning and power in the core iconography with profound implications to social structure, ritual power, and political authority. These are important. You know, this is very different from ideas where the core evolve out of pure form. Another one I really like is this multimedia approach, the shifting configurations over time of different knowledge, technologies, and practices. As she laid out, ceramics, jade, ivory, bone, bronzes, lacquer, and the technology of communication, that's writing, archival inscriptions, divination texts, all of these, to see them in a changing configuration of development. That's fascinating. Okay. The fourth point I really like is this emphasis on emic terminology. The students today really wants ontological, non-Western ontologies. This push for this ontological term, except they have very poor understanding of non-Western conceptual frameworks. So Becky's identification, sorry, I forgot to mention this is a co-authored book. I've never met Dr. Major, and I have to, congratulate both of you for putting this together. So their choice of these amic terms very specific to Chinese culture, this spiritual empowerment, to become spiritually empowered, indulge one with this power and religious efficacy. These are fascinating. Wu as shamans, that has been a broad connections people make. This idea of strange, supernatural, esoteric. To this concept, it shows very nuanced, sophisticated understanding of Chinese culture. And also being, the arrival, to bring the spirit down, to host this divinity. Again, I like these concepts. My questions is basically related to the central theme, where from Neolithic to classical era, that these Chinese art remained these mask designs remained fundamental to Chinese ways of thinking about the world and human interactions with that world. So this mask motif, metamorphic mask, is a principal motif in early Chinese art. It's very essential in Chinese religion. So my question would be, I'm sure many Chinese readers would like to hear that too. That is, what contribute to this extraordinary resilience, against millennia of changes, transformations, this continuity versus diversity. And if you look at Liangzhu, for example, I will show you next, its iconography is very exact. It's almost the mirror image of the same mask design. So it's the tyranny of forms. But if you look at Shang bronzes iconography, they are always very dynamic. So that introduces a problem, a question. That is, if it is an ancestor in transformation in Liangzhu society, which one are we talking about? Once we enter the Shang period, it's such diverse iconography forms. What caused that change? And also that's related to the question of Siberian shamanism and interactions. As I have laid out in chapter 4 of my book, that there's expanded interactions with the broader Eurasian world during the late 3rd millennium BC, the Longshan period, where metallurgy and other technologies, religious practices are introduced to Neolithic society in China. Whether there's these contributions, not only in the late 3rd millennium, but through the Bronze Age. For example, this image Becky have shown us, they look like a master of animal design from Middle East. Okay, so these designs, you know, an animal holding 2 snakes, you see them in Central Asia. So as we look at the resilience of this form, you know, how do we also account for changes resulting from these interactions? So yeah, this is the image I'm talking about. Throughout Liangzhu society, you see this image replicated again and again. I agree it is metamorphic, but what I'm curious is the basic form stayed, but the content, once you reach the Shang period, you can't say that is the image, because all different part of the animal, different kind of animals, all mixed together all the time. So that's a question I'm very curious about. Another question, of course, is related to this expanding Eurasian interactions and the potential contribution of Siberian ritual practices. This is the map showing the scope of Longshan interaction. So basically, you have at this period in Altai, you have a very vibrant bronze working culture. The Okinev society, they have this sophisticated tin bronze technology called semi-turbino metamorphic metallurgic phenomena. And when you look at an Okinov society, it possesses all the defining attributes of Siberian shamanism. You know, this rock art with these psychedelic images, with these sun rays spreading out. Very classical trade has developed over 4,000 years ago. And it is during this same period, these Northern Asian societies was interacting with Neolithic societies along the Heshi corridor and the highland regions of Longshan society, where metallurgy, which is technology very central to Altai region, is coming in. And metallurgic transformation is magical. Okay, so we cannot separate the technology, the production process with the religious implication, with the iconography that's carried on these vessels. Okay, so Casey Chang talked about these vessels as mediums of religious communication during the Shang period. If you control these mediums, ritual vessels, and the raw materials to make these vessels, then you control, you monopolize the path to political authority. But this technology, this medium is not old in China. It's only 4,000 years old. But this ritual practice, all these designs going back to Neolithic, those are indigenous. So this technology, these new forms, are recent introductions. How did these contribute to what we have observed in the Shang? Is the question I'm very curious about. And also is during this period, around 2300 BC, beginning of the Longshan period, you notice my dates are different from Becky's, okay, because of more recent adjustment. And it's around the beginning of this interaction, around 2300 BC, that the Liangzhu society on the coast, it collapsed. With the collapse, you see the diaspora of these jade forms going all the way to Upper Yellow River and Lost Plateau. So you basically see northern shamanism, northern technologies, metallurgy, and herding culture, all of these things, oracle bone divination, which is not native to Chinese Neolithic, it's all coming in from the northern direction, and then these jade forms and the mask designs, the ones carried, going up. So what kind of convergence it took place? Whether we can examine this continuity resilience of this metamorphic mask, without understanding this continental scale interaction. It is during this period we see these performative aspect of shamanism that's later in ethnography would associate with Altai-Siberian practice. For example, the presence of these cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean direction, not from the China coast. It's appearing in the frontlets or clothing or jewelries of these Longshan, highland Longshan communities in western part of China. And you see mirrors coming in. And when you look at ethnographic material, it's the same thing today. Mirrors, bells, cowrie shells for protection. So it is the same package that's coming in at the onset of Bronze Age transition in China, which also you see that in Shimao and later in Arlito. And in Shimao, you see these different traditions, ritual traditions coming together in an almost syncretic phenomena. Why is Becky in the waiting room? Should I unmute her? Okay. So is Becky talking to us? Becky, can you unmute yourself?
Hi. She's been watching all of this remotely on my phone, and she's finally been accepted out of the waiting room, it sounds like. So.
Okay, that's fine, as long as we're not. So what I'm saying is these images, if we look at them as classical players, they are now into a very contemporary theater 4,000 years ago. And what the Shang indeed inherited is the product of these syncretic development involving contributions from very different sources. And in light of that development, when you see these early metal pieces that is discovered in Taosi and some in Shimao, you can see its ritual and even shamanistic characteristics. Toad is a favorite theme of shamanism because of the poison. Okay, many shamanistic practice shamans, they would acquire that hallucinogenic ability. And Peter First is the one that laid this out in Mayan shamanistic practices. Bells, the sound of the bells, very penetrating. And you see these ritual dance in Arlington, likely, performed with the costume, with these jade tokens. And also you see these coral shells around the collar, and then these bells with jade clapper that convey this extraordinary sound that the Neolithic society would have never experienced. And then my question would be, what does this metallurgic transformation itself contribute, to the whole process of metamorphism that's not only appeared in iconography and decor, but in the creation of the substance, this urban spectacle, where we could even think about the legend of the Great Yu as a shamanistic practice that's emerging during this syncretic development. And we see this in Qiang communities, it still preserves that shamanistic aura. where the performance of this landscape, a legendary landscape attributed to 4,000 years ago, still gave extraordinary healing power to shamans and the Taoist priests in historical era. And it's in against this background, I invite people to think about this institutional shamanism of the Shang monarchy. That is, in what aspect of it comes from a prehistorical past, like Liangzhu, Longshan, Hongshan. What aspect of it owe its origin to Siberian and Altai shamanism, especially through those metallurgists. And the oracle bone divination, as you remember, the Longshan introduction, the farmers of Neolithic China, they don't use that practice. So all of these are questions, I think, is not what I try to find answer from this book, but encourage the readers to think in light with these more recent archaeological evidence, how much of these developments 4,000 years ago contribute to what we have seen in later forms, including, practitioners like the first emperor. And when you look at the shrine, the itineraries is try to follow the footsteps of the great Yu in a way that the emperor is performing the landscape, which is shamanistic, but also imperial in scope. And also when you look at the shape of this mushroom island, and you kind of think, yes, these magic mushrooms, these potent substances, probably indeed play a role. Cinnabar and all these Urus aspects of later, religious Taoism probably find these roots. So I'm not ready to say goodbye to those hallucinogenic pursuits Michael just critiqued. So I will end here. That's basically my take on this idea of shamanism. That is the performance of Yu itself was a religious response to the climatic change in the late 3rd millennium BC. So shamanism at a grand scale. In that way, the Arlito and the Shang and then the Zhou are all kind of heirs to these traditions, and then they take it in their own directions. Okay, so that's my take on this. These questions are meant to, stimulate discussions. Thank you.
If Dr. Charles Johnson have anything you want to reply to discussions, or we can open the floor to discussion too.
Are you in agreement, and Li Min, do we use institutionalized shamanism, but not hunting shamanism? Tom?
Yeah, say that again.
I think it's a two-slide shaman. The whole sort of situation in my and John's eyes, and mine in particular, in this Shang study they have upcoming, is that ancestor worship had to be coordinated with shamanic belief, basically. And so as a way of making control of that, there was a sort of institutionalization of certain practices. And that's where the hunting image comes into the fore, because most of the masks, are hunting masks. But as time went on, this sort of metamorphic imagery took on a more generalized, significance. And that's what I think. And then it evolved. I mean, it's sort of the fundamental of sort of Chinese belief in the power of nature. And there's this liminal quality that you see in oracle bone inscriptions, as well as in Taoism. Of after death, the spirit goes into this sort of realm where you see represented pictorially on all sorts of bronzes the hunt, and it's sort of the transition that the soul makes between death and the other world of nature. Right.
So the whole question of institutionalization is quite interesting in relation to shamanism.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
as Li Min was talking about, and yeah, this is quite clear that there is a tension between shamanic authority and centralized authority in most cases, right? There's
Yeah.
two different sources of authority
Yeah.
that clash. But what happens when it's the king himself who is the shamanic performer, the central performer of the shamanic events, right? Then that changes that whole equation. The centralized power is shamanic power, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I mean, there is this, this later evolution in the Zhou period with this, this this so-called corpse or this assistant to the king. But that's a later sort of secularization of and degradation of the centralized power of the king into a more
Right.
massive appeal to the hoi polloi.
Yeah.
So you see that changing, but you see these two streams, and as Lehman and you both, I mean, it's really cool to see them interact and see what happens to them, because nothing's ever lost in Chinese tradition. Nothing, it
Right.
just it reappears and reappears. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think
So,
one flaw is, in this argument of ritual authority of shamanistic kings, is the people couldn't distinguish a claim versus reality. That is, there's a limit of power. If the Shang ruler can achieve its full authority as a king through shamanistic practice of being the chief priest by monopolizing religious communication, then he doesn't need to have military campaigns anymore. Clearly those people who were captured and sacrificed, they are not included in this religious realm, because you even deny those people full membership as humans. So clearly there's a different, even there's a projection of Shang kingship to, monopoly of religious communication. There are many, many other claims, especially on these highland regions and also on the coast. Those people have their own views about religious efficacy.
right.
And the Shang king has no patience explaining to them, right? It is more of military forces. So we have to see the ideal reality.
But that's what happens with ancestor worship. I mean, it becomes sort of a political, transition of gaining control through ancestral powers, and this ability to make contact with them. I mean, when you put a big lamb shank in a gui vessel to eat, I mean, this lamb is being eaten by the spirits. I mean, it's not just there for feasting afterwards. So, and I think that the Shang king was he peregrinated. He went all over the kingdom. He was constantly on call, and to demonstrate his power. And right, it was through military prowess, but also it was through his imperialistic sort of power to engage obeisance, or at least authority over all of these so-called states. And it certainly was his power to magically invoke spirits that maybe abstractly influence these various states and their leaders. But it's certainly what the chieftain in Liangzhu society did too. I mean, he was chieftain over the wild, the wild wilderness.
Sorry, I interrupted Michael. So can you?
Oh, sorry, Michael. Did I interrupt you too?
No, I did. I did. So I better have him return to the podium.
It seems like Ken have a question too. He typed about the metamorphic body versus the eye in the standard Tao Tai. It seems the abstract, dynamic, and metamorphic imagery of the not eyes regularly function to define the fixed, focal, and prominent eyes through contrast. almost seems like an intentional dualism. In most of Dr. Charles Johnson's metamorphic image, the eyes are a bit less prominent than the standard Tau type, is disproportionately large. Is in this new theory, is there any singling out of the eye as opposed to the rest of the metamorphic body?
Oh, yes. I mean, John and I would discuss this at great length. It's particularly obvious in the Liangzhu imagery of this, this semi-human on top of a mask image. The eyes are huge. And I believe that, yes, it probably has to do with the power of the seeing world and the power of, seeing, beyond death or beyond, beyond the regular realm that you're dealing with. And certainly that was definitely an attribute of Liangzhu imagery, and then co-opted then by Longshan imagery, and then co-opted by Shang, which reverted more to this combination of hunted wild mask images, along with the same sort of attribute of visual power. I don't know if that answered the question. Did it?
May I jump in here? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's my question is not so much about us seeing beyond death, but actually what is beyond death watching us. And the reason why I ask this is because when we see Shijing poems and so forth talking about we can't see them, but they are actually surveilling us. In the parenthetical bit that I've got in there, that I mentioned that there have been a lot of studies that people have been applying studies to the mere representation of the presence of a representation of an eye actually causes the people to behave differently. And this has been applied to religious art elsewhere. We haven't applied it yet to these ritual bronzes yet, as far as I know, but I'm wondering if it's time we should be thinking about these eyes, because what really strikes
the eyes of in Liangzhu imagery, for example, the eyes of the mask are the same eyes that are used to represent the power of flight in these so-called feng birds. I mean, it's really extraordinary. So, I mean, in that particular connections, it's crystal clear that the eye is a power of vision and power to metamorphosis and flight. I mean, it's both of those attributes, and you see it very clearly in Liangzhu jade imagery, very clearly, and then it's continued. Continues to be emphasized in Shang ritual mask imagery.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Do anyone else have any questions?
Tom, did you want to continue with a point you were making?
No.
You sure?
My screen keeps freezing and I'm trying to coax it back. So maybe you thought I was making a point.
We'll
I
use
was
some of
trying
that
to make a
shamanic
point
power.
to my computer.
I don't know why we can't get John in here. Is there a way we can?
We cannot know unless he contact us from this end, because we have no idea what's going on the other side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm
it says he's
disappointed
here,
that he's
and I know he wanted to chime in. But anyway, never mind.
So do you see a relation between the metamorphosis and the beings that we see in the Shanghai Jing and the
Yeah, I do.
Xian?
I do.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult because the Shanghai Jing is so wild. I mean, everything's, it's very difficult to excuse me, to isolate. Yeah, I do think that the idea that you have this mythical geography is very much associated with the idea of the other world, the wildness of nature. And but it's very difficult to deal, despite the fact that Tao Te appears there, and other images. Well, what do you think, Tom? Can you hear me?
even not in the Shanghai Jing, but in other writings and visual works, we see the Xian, with
Yeah.
very animalistic bodies, wings, and all kinds of things like that.
No, I think I think it's very much related, and I'm trying to think of there was a person who did actually comment on that, who was a student, who's actually in Taiwan at the moment, but he sort of he wrote extensively on the probable connection that the Shanghai Jing, or certain parts of the Shanghai Jing, or one or two parts in particular, were definitely related to shamanism.
Right. Yeah.
And when you see all these little, and there's this one extremely entertaining detail on one of the Joe bronzes of an image who's crouching in this sort of fetal position with wings, and the face turns out at you. You may have seen it in my book. It's just so, I mean, it's so indicative of the humor plus the love for representing these Shen in different forms. Anyway.
So when we look at, for example, the Jogo, the Li Sao from the Chutsa, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's shamanism. That's,
Departing
that
sorrow.
in Orgone inscriptions, you get, rising and falling, or shang of spirits, including Shangdi, and the king's ability to rise to Shangdi and to ancestor spirits. So the Chutsa is very much of that, looking back at the wonders of life on his way to some. Well, I have to reread what you wrote on the Li Sao to find out what your outlook is.
I haven't written much on the Li Sao.
You
I'm
did some,
daunted.
didn't you?
I've written extensively on the Joga, on the 9 songs.
Or the Jogo
I
and the
did-
9 songs. Okay.
But what's interesting about the 9 songs in relation to this is there's, except for the war poems, something like that, there's no mention of the ancestors as spiritual beings to communicate with. They're all nature spirits.
Yeah, it's weird. Gopal Suku mentioned in his he wrote an introduction for my ebook along with John Major, and he says if we could just connect the Ling of Zhou text with something in Shang Oracle Bone inscriptions, and I haven't really gone into detail, but then we could find a sort of direct link between the historical traditions.
Yeah, so I just wrote a paper. Part of what I was talking about was the Shang is something else with D, but when we get to the Western Zhou and then the spring and autumn period, the Tianming, the mandate of heaven, was solely focused on the ruling lineage, the ruler and the ruling family, right?
Yeah, that's a direct
And-
heritage from Shang. Tian,
Right?
yeah.
But then when we get into the retributions of heaven can target anybody. It's not just the royal family, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the big difference between Western Zhou and Shang, is the concept of morality that's
Right.
associated with Tian.
But what I'm thinking about is, as heaven, or the Ming of heaven, was exclusively directed to the royal lineage,
Yeah.
so was the institutionalized shamanism centered on the king and the royal family, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And as the mandate of heaven lost its authority, as you go through the spring and autumn period,
Yeah.
the notion of Tian itself became more democratized,
Yeah. And
Right.
secularized. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that seems to be what's happening also with shamanism. It becomes decoupled from kingship together with the shrinking of royal authority.
Yeah.
And so then you get, right, even the Chutsa, even the Lisa, well, in terms of the shamanic processes, neither the Lisa nor the Joga, they don't mention ancestors and they don't mention kings either,
No, because they're right. Hey,
right? So it's a democratization.
Yeah, I think that's just that's what happens. I mean, things become degraded. It's true in terms of the imagery. It becomes sort of meaningless and decorative. But I mean, there's always this there is this current that is never lost in terms of, what's practiced locally and maybe taken on local cultic, practices. I mean, in Taiwan today, you can go to Longshan Se and you can see that people are casting their whatever sticks to find out what the idea of luck and the association with mythical powers, and some of the images in these are of humans dressed up with horse heads and stuff like that. And I think that's a direct reflection of this stream of the wild being identified with supernatural power.
Yeah.
But
so it's 10:46 at the moment. Do anyone have any last minute questions, or we can maybe call an end to the event today?
sure, it's up to you. You're the director.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending the virtual book event. We encourage everyone to follow us on the social media. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Charles Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Michael and Dr. Lee, for giving this fantastic book talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot. We'll talk.
Becky, I'm sure you'll be in touch with John very soon. Please give him my
I
warmest
will. He
regards.
must have, I don't know what
Warmest
happened
regards.
to him, but I'll be in touch. Yeah,
Great.
no, he had a good time with you in Beijing, and he's working on a lot of different things right now, but he's so happy that our book finally came out. He's just really proud of it. So I'm
Me
really
too.
glad. Anyway, we'll speak soon. Okay, Mr.
Congratulations.
Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Nice
Bye.
to meet you, Lehman.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.